On the 29th of December 1972, 176 souls boarded an Eastern Airlines jumbo jet at JFK Airport in New York, bound for Miami International, Flight 401. For almost the entirety of the flight, everything on board was totally fine. Passengers were looking forward to reaching their destination, ready to see in the new year with loved ones in just a couple of days, but they would never make it. Because Flight 401 would crash in the watery wilderness of the Everglades, resulting in the deaths of 101 people that night. It was a tragic, avoidable disaster, and it shook everyone at Eastern Airlines to their core, losing colleagues and friends in such a horrific way. And so in the throes of grief, it wouldn't be out of the ordinary to feel like you could see your deceased co-workers in places where you knew them best, up in the sky. As it wasn't long before Eastern Airlines crew started to come forward, claiming that they had witnessed crew members from the ill-fated Flight 401 on other flights. But where this story takes a bit of a turn is when staff and even passengers who didn't know anyone from Flight 401 personally, and certainly wouldn't have known who they were, started to also claim that they had seen weird things. Crew members who weren't really there, people who had vanished right in front of them, and strong, uneasy feelings like they were being watched. The corporate higher-ups at Eastern Airlines were having none of it though, threatening staff with repercussions for coming forward and telling their stories. But even with their threats, the witness testimonies persisted. But what could explain these sightings? Were they simply the manifestations of grief and trauma, or was something more unexplainable taking place? And would it have anything to do with the claims that parts of Flight 401 had been salvaged and installed on other Eastern Airlines aircraft? Those very same planes on which people had allegedly witnessed these strange encounters. And so let's just talk about this plane for a moment, because she was fancy. We're not talking a regular old rickety tin can in the sky here. She was a Lockheed L-1011 TriStar with the registration number N310EA. And so I'm going to call her plane 310 because that's just simpler for me to say, but it will be important later on. And Eastern Airlines, they had pretty much only just gotten their hands on this plane. She was almost brand spanking new. She was delivered on the 18th of August 1972, and just 3 days later she was up in the skies flying commercially. And this plane would have cost $20 million to purchase and was absolutely massive. The 70s was the time where air travel was becoming more accessible to more people. More passengers were able to and wanted to fly, so they needed bigger planes. Hence the production of huge, great big jumbo jets like the L-1011. And so on board, you'd have 2 aisles. You'd have 2 rows of seats on the sides by the windows, and then a big old row in the middle with 5 seats. It was huge. The L-1011 was also a double-decker plane, with the upstairs being the main floor, really, where all of the passengers would have been sat. But then take a tiny little lift down and cabin crew would be able to access the galley, basically the kitchen where they would prepare all of your meals. And these jumbo jets, Eastern Airlines called them the whisper liner because they were super quiet on takeoff and then while they were up in the air as well. There'd be a distinct lack of noise in the cabin, almost enough to make you forget that you were hurtling through the sky at hundreds of miles an hour. But another nifty little feature was that the plane had an autopilot system, which meant it could land itself even in zero visibility. And this kind of technology for 1972 was state of the art, top tier, cutting edge. Take your pick of the buzzwords. And on the 29th of December 1972, this plane, being only 4 months old at this point, was at the John F. Kennedy International Airport in Queens, New York, boarding its passengers for a routine flight down to Miami International Airport in Florida. Flight 401 that night was carrying 163 passengers, as well as 13 crew members, 10 flight attendants, and 3 flight crew in the cockpit. And these guys, they were solid. They were exactly the type of person you would have wanted flying your jumbo jet. First off in the pilot's seat was Captain Robert Albin Loft, also known as Bob, and at 55 years old he was a veteran pilot, tens of thousands of flight hours under his belt, solid guy. And then as co-pilot there was First Officer Albin John Stockstill, also known as Bert. He was a bit younger than Bob Loft at 39 years old with 5,800 flight hours logged, but he'd actually logged more flight hours on the L-1011s than Bob had, so between these two, you were in capable hands. And then rounding out the flight deck crew was flight engineer Donald Louis Repo, known by the name Don. And so your flight engineer, he's basically the techie of the group, making sure engines and systems are working smoothly. Also in the cockpit that night was technical officer Angelo Donadio, but he wasn't actually technically working, he was just hitching a ride to Miami. It's called deadheading, which is actually a bit of an ironic name given what we're going to be talking about today. But it's basically where your next scheduled flight is taking off from a different airport, and so you can just grab an empty seat on a flight operated by your airline to get you there. And so at 9:20 p.m, Flight 401 is given the go-ahead to taxi to the runway, and they take off into the dark night sky from JFK International towards Miami. And for the first 2 hours, everything's peachy. The Whisperliner is doing her job, passengers are comfortable, it's a smooth ride, maybe get served a few peanuts and an aperitif, you know. At 11:32 p.m, Flight 401 starts the descent into Miami International Airport. So far, so good. But Stockstill, the first officer, he's doing his thing, he lowers the landing gear when, wait, hang on, we have a bit of a problem. So there are 3 indicator lights for the plane's landing gear. One is for the right gear, the left gear, and then the nose gear. And these indicators are just supposed to tell you, hey, your landing gear's down and locked, you're all good. But the light of the nose gear, it didn't light up. First off, they try the good old off and on again, and so they raise the landing gear and then lower it down again to see if the light switch is on, but no. So Captain Bob Loft, being the cool, calm and collected chap he is, he just reaches out to Miami Air Traffic Control and tells them, basically, we're having a little bit of a nose gear situation up here, we just need to hang out and figure this out before we come into land. The tower tells them, no problem, climb up to 2,000 feet and take a nice westerly spin over the Florida Everglades and we can sort this out. Once they get up to altitude, Captain Loft tells Bert to hit the autopilot, keep this bird steady while we get to the bottom of what's going on. And so at 11:41 p.m, the autopilot is officially on. And they're trying to figure out why this light isn't coming on when Captain Loft turns around in his seat to Don Repo, the flight engineer, and asks him, just go down into the hellhole. Which, brilliant nickname, but it's basically this tiny cramped avionics bay underneath the cockpit, where you can go and there's a little portal window and just actually look yourself, see if the nose gear is actually down. Don goes down there, takes a peek, but he can't confirm anything. The nose gear might be down, but also might not. Not a super reassuring conclusion, but it's about to get a whole lot worse. You see, because when Captain Loft had turned around to talk to Don Repo, he'd maybe accidentally scooched his leg forward just a touch, had knocked the control column ever so slightly, but that slight movement, that had been enough to switch the plane's autopilot into control wheel steering mode. Basically, the autopilot will stop holding altitude and will maintain whatever angle the pilot sets. And so by pushing that column forward just that tiniest little bit, the plane has started a super subtle descent that no one in the cockpit noticed. They're still there trying to figure out this stupid light bulb situation, pulling the light out, putting it back in, trying anything to get it to work. And still at this point, by the voices captured on the flight recorder, it seems like the crew sees this as more of a faff rather than anything like an emergency. All the while, things are happening around them. For the first minute and 20 seconds after engaging the control wheel steering mode, the plane is flying level. And then she gradually drops 100 feet, but no one notices. She levels off for another 2 minutes before descending again, slowly, quietly, and by another 250 feet over the next minute and 10 seconds. At this point, other failsafes start coming into play. An altitude warning alarm actually starts going off, but apparently no one hears it, not a peep. Don Repo's still down in the hellhole, now accompanied by Donadio. The rest of the crew are fiddling around with his burned out light bulb. All the while, the plane is ever so slowly falling from the sky. And they're just oblivious. By 50 seconds after this altitude warning alarm has gone off, the plane has dropped 1,000 feet. They were only initially cruising at 2,000 and they'd lost half of their altitude without noticing. It's First Officer Bert Stockstill. As he's turning the plane to a heading of 180 degrees, he finally looks at the altimeter and realizes, oh, we're not at 2,000 feet anymore. He says out loud, we did something to the altitude. Naturally, Loft questions it like, excuse me, what did you just say? Stockstill questions back, we're still at 2,000 feet, right? And then comes the last thing captured on the cockpit voice recorder, Loft saying, hey, what's happening here? What's happening, you say? Just the worst case scenario? At 227 miles an hour, Flight 401 slams into the Everglades, almost 19 miles away from the Miami runway. Down on the ground, there were 2 friends, Robert Markey, known as Bud, and Ray Dickinson, who were out on the Everglades not too far away in an airboat that Bud had built himself. They were out on that moonless night gigging for frogs, which is where you have a little spear on the end of a stick and hunt frogs to cook up frogs' legs. They're just out there, all normal, all fine, catching them frogs, when they see this massive fireball light up the entire area around them. And then just like that, the light was gone, and they were back in the pitch darkness. Bud doesn't waste a second. They immediately raced in the airboat to the site where they saw the fireball. He knows the area like the back of his hand, navigating through in the complete darkness. There isn't even the light of the moon to go by. As he gets closer, they still can't see anything, but they start to hear the voices. It sounds like hundreds of people screaming, crying, crying, shouting for help. All Bud has is his little head torch and he's shining it about, and it's looking like a scene out of a horror video game everywhere he looks. Twisted metal all entwined in the sawgrass. Body parts and luggage strewn about the water. Survivors with their clothes blown off in the crash, wandering about aimlessly. Without hesitating, Bud jumps off the airboat and starts to help whoever he comes across. Passengers who were still strapped into chairs which had been overturned, leaving them with their faces in the shallow water. He'd help free them and stop them from drowning. Anyone he could, he'd pull them onto the airboat, out of the water. Bud knew better than anyone that just because the plane was down, the survivors weren't safe. They're sharing that swamp water with gators, snakes, even the plants. That sawgrass isn't called sawgrass for nothing. It's sharp enough to cut you. There's jet fuel spilling out everywhere, coating the water, covering Bud's skin and choking his airways, but still, he doesn't stop helping. After a bit of time, they notice a helicopter up in the sky. It's the Coast Guard, obviously searching for the wreckage. So Bud takes his headlight and directs them to the crash site. And an hour and 4 minutes after Flight 401 went down, the first victims are helicoptered out. Bud continued working through the night, ending up with burns to his arms, legs and face from wading in all of that jet fuel. 8 flight attendants were also doing what they could in the chaos too, directing passengers and getting them to sing Christmas carols to keep their minds occupied. But there was no denying the brutal reality of their situation. Once the dust had settled and the death toll had been counted, 99 people had died that night, with a further 2 dying in hospital of their injuries afterwards. Most of the sources say that a total of 101 people died, with those 2 passing away from their injuries in hospital. But the official survivors website says that a total of 103 people actually died. And they said that there was an extra 2 passengers who died in hospital in January. And so maybe that might have been after the official count, maybe? But if you know for sure which one it is, please do let me know. Captain Bob Loft, he had initially survived the crash, but he tragically passed away in the wreckage of the cockpit before he could be taken to hospital. First Officer Bert Stockstill was killed immediately on impact. Second Officer, Flight Engineer Don Repo, he did actually make it to hospital, but he was one of those that passed away afterwards, dying of his injuries a couple of days later on the 31st of December. The only member of the flight crew to survive and recover was Angelo Donadio, and as both him and Repo had been down in the so-called hellhole and survived the initial crash, that may have been the thing that spared him from the worst of the impact. And so before we go on, I know that that was a really rough story, and I've actually spared you from the worst of it. We get some particularly brutal descriptions in John G. Fuller's book, The Ghost of Flight 401, including what happens to a pregnant woman that I think is going to live on in my head for the rest of my life. So if you're going to read that book to research further, this is your warning. It's not nice. Out of all the survivors though, every single one of them was injured in varying severity. The most common injuries were, of course, broken bones, damage to hips, spines, ribs, legs. Some had been burned, and 17 were lucky enough to walk away with just minor injuries that didn't need hospitalization. And it seemed like crashing in the Everglades was a blessing in some ways, but a curse in others. The swamp water may have cushioned the impact somewhat and actually prevented more fatalities, and then the mud packed survivors' wounds and stopped them from bleeding out. But then, of course, you've got the sawgrass cutting people up even more, and then the bacteria from that mud getting into people's bloodstreams. And actually 8 people ended up with gas gangrene, which do not Google image search that. It's not nice. Basically, the bacteria causing the infection starts releasing gas inside your body, and it is, for obvious reasons, not a good situation to be in. And so then, after the crash, there was the inevitable investigation. Eastern Airlines Flight 401 had been the first ever crash of a jumbo jet, and it was the deadliest civil aviation disaster to have happened in the USA at that point. The National Transportation Safety Board, aka the NTSB, the people who figure out why planes fall out of the sky, their final report pointed to pilot error. They classified the crash as a controlled flight into terrain, or CFIT, which is basically saying that the plane flew into the ground while the crew still had control of it. It just seems absolutely incomprehensible that the flight crew could have just not noticed what was going on. They were distracted, yeah, but enough to not have a single clue what was going on. But the thing that you've got to remember is they were flying over the Everglades. It's pitch black out there. There's just endless swamp in every direction. There are no lights, no buildings, no landmarks to give them any sense of how close they were to the ground. Kind of terrifying to think that by the time that they'd noticed, it was too late. The report found that the only thing to have failed on that plane was the light bulb. That little green light bulb that was supposed to tell them that the nose gear was down, it just burned out, because the nose gear was in fact down and operating as it should have. They could have even attempted to land, even without the confirmation that the nose landing gear was down, anticipating a partial gear up landing, and they would have been totally fine. This crash, along with others in the 70s like the Tenerife airport disaster, where 2 planes collided on the runway and killed almost 600 people, as well as United Airlines Flight 173, which went down while they were also trying to troubleshoot a landing gear issue. They contributed to what is now called Crew Resource Management, or CRM for short, where crew members would be trained on things like communication, problem solving, things like that. And even now, pilots going through their CRM training say that the case of Flight 401 has a huge influence in what they're taught. How, above all else, whatever is going on in the cockpit, remember to fly the plane. Torches were also added as standard equipment after Flight 401's crash, as the stewardesses had to fight to keep passengers from lighting matches to be able to see an inch in front of their face in the pitch black Everglades. Something that you most definitely do not want to do, considering you're surrounded by leaking jet fuel and all of that. And so, before we go any further, I feel like we really need to just take a moment to remember the very real, very profound tragedy of Flight 401. This crash left a lasting impact on everyone involved. The passengers, the crew, their families, the rescuers. I mean, imagine surviving something like that, witnessing what they had witnessed. That's the kind of trauma that stays with you forever. Bud Marquis, our frog-gigging airboat hero, is it Marquis or Marquis? I think I've said both in this video anyway. But eventually, he was honoured for his incredible bravery. He received the Humanitarian Award from the National Air Disaster Alliance and Foundation, and the Alumatech Airboat Hero Award from the American Airboat Search and Rescue Association. This man put his life on the line, navigating the Everglades in pitch blackness, pulling people out of a literal nightmare, all while burned and covered in jet fuel. He is the definition of a hero. But of course, Bud wasn't alone. There were so many other heroes that night. Rescuers, first responders, the flight attendants, even passengers helped each other out of the wreckage. All of them worked in dangerous, chaotic conditions to save as many lives as they could, and they deserve all of the recognition for that. But here is where the story takes that little turn, because there's a legend that goes that after the investigation had wrapped up, some of the avionics and galley equipment was salvaged from the plane, where it was sent back to the manufacturer to make sure it was all properly working again, before being used on other Eastern Airlines planes. Apparently, there were shortages and delays on Lockheed's production line, and this plane, Plane 310, flight number 401, she'd only been 4 months old, so they had allegedly taken off and recovered what they could. But almost immediately after these parts had been put onto other Eastern Airlines L-1011 TriStars, crew members and passengers started reporting strange things happening on their flights. And by strange, I mean full-on ghost sightings. And we're not talking your typical floaty, see-through ghosts flitting about in the corner of your eye. People were seeing full-body apparitions, super lifelike. People didn't even realise they were seeing ghosts because the figures looked so real. The only clue they'd have that something was amiss was that most of the time they might not get a huge amount of conversation out of them. Oh, and they'd also vanish into thin air right in front of your eyes. That's a big one. And there seemed to be two distinct characters who were spotted over and over again: Captain Bob Loft and flight engineer Don Repo. And the reason we know this is because they appeared to colleagues who had flown with them before the horrific crash, so obviously they would recognise them. But they also appeared to passengers, people who had never met Captain Loft or Don Repo before. These passengers would describe seeing someone strange, and when they were later shown a photograph, they'd point to Loft or Repo and say, yep, that's the person I saw. Which, I mean, that's a little harder to explain away, right? And as time went on, there were more and more of these stories coming out, and they were coming from sane, respectable witnesses, captains, first officers, second officers, seasoned professionals who were trained to stay calm and level-headed. But what they experienced was enough for them to pipe up and say, actually, I saw something and no, I can't explain it away. There were others who would refuse to talk about the specifics of what had happened to them. Some would just laugh it off, and then if you asked them to go and work alone in the lower galley, so that's the little kitchen area under the main floor in the L-1011, yeah, no, absolutely not. Some flight attendants even got to the point where they flat out refused to work down there at all. Honestly, big same. According to John G. Fuller in his book The Ghost of Flight 401, he claimed that after speaking to so many Eastern Airlines employees, he was confident that this was not some big public phenomenon. The passengers on these flights did not know about the weirdness that was going on with some of these planes. And we're still talking the 70s here. There's no internet, there's no Google to be sharing these stories. But that within the airline industry, oh, it was this open secret. Oh yeah, those Eastern Airlines L-1011s, they've got ghosts on them. The big corporate bigwigs at Eastern Airlines, though, they were having none of it. They made super clear that they did not want anyone talking about ghosts on their planes. Management even went so far as to warn employees that they could be fired if they were caught spreading these stories. But that didn't stop the stories coming out, albeit anonymously, of course. And so that's why John G. Fuller had so many accounts in his book specifically, because he'd interviewed so many Eastern Airlines employees. And not only that, but apparently one of these higher-ups in Eastern Airlines had his own paranormal encounter. There was a senior vice president who boarded one of Eastern Airlines' L-1011s at JFK for a flight to Florida. And he was there sitting in the first class cabin, because of course he would be. And this man in a pilot's uniform comes up the aisle and asks if the seat next to the vice president is taken. The VP assumed it's just another pilot deadheading, catching a ride to the next airport, and so he's like, yeah, sure, have a seat. They start chatting, talking about work, as you do, but then the VP started feeling a bit weird. Like he'd recognized this guy, but just couldn't place him. He was looking at the pilot, who was just sitting there, staring out of the window, admittedly a little distracted, and then the VP mentioned the Flight 401 crash. As soon as the words had left his lips, the pilot turned to look straight at him, and the VP's blood ran cold. You know what it feels like when your heart drops? The floor is just given away under you as you come to some earth-shattering realization. The vice president had this exact feeling as it suddenly clicked where he knew this pilot from. He was staring into the eyes of Captain Bob Loft, the same Captain Loft who had died in the Everglades on Flight 401. The VP naturally started to freak out, but before he could say anything, Captain Loft just vanished. Right there in front of him, just gone. He demanded to be led off the plane, pushing through the other passengers who were trying to find their seats in economy. He ran straight to the Eastern Airlines ticket desk and asked, "Who was that pilot who was just on that plane that I was on?" The person at the desk says, no pilot boarded that flight. So that is very weird. And that is just an example out of the many, many witness reports. But it is just interesting that a lot of them seem to centre around one plane in particular, with the tail number N318EA. But I'll just call her plane 318 for simplicity. Apparently, 318 was the recipient of most of the salvaged parts from the Flight 401 crash. And so that's the reason why so many people have reported weird things on this aircraft. So much so that she developed a bit of a reputation. Some Eastern Airlines cockpit crews would refuse to fly her, not because she was unsafe or anything like that, but just because they felt uneasy, that spine-tingling, something ain't right here kind of uneasy. Which apparently went so far that, although they'd never straight up admit it, there were rumours that Eastern Airlines were going to change 318's number to try and get away from these stories. There was also the logbook, which is kept as a record of the plane's history, safety, maintenance and all of that. And there was this one crew member who recalled that any time that she was flying on 318, there would always be a brand new logbook. Why did they keep getting replaced? Could it have had anything to do with the frequency with which people were reporting strange things happening on this plane? And Eastern Airlines were trying to cover it up by removing the logbook with the offending entry in it. Was it perhaps Captain Loft making his presence known again, just like he did to the VP? Just something to think about. When plane 318 was at Newark Liberty International Airport in New Jersey, preparing for a flight to Miami, everything seemed totally normal. Passengers had boarded, the crew were doing their pre-flight checks, a flight attendant was busy with a head count, but she was having a bit of a headache with it because the number wasn't adding up. Eventually, she found that there was a man sitting in first class who, according to the manifest, shouldn't have been there. He was wearing an Eastern Airlines captain's uniform, so the immediate assumption was, oh, he must have been deadheading. And so she went over to him because obviously she still has to confirm who he is and that deadheading is exactly what he is doing, so she just asked. But the man didn't respond, just sat there completely silent, staring blankly ahead. So she tried again and again to get this guy's attention, but nothing was working. She called over another flight attendant who had just as much luck as she did, and so then they roped in the captain to see if he could get through to him. By this point, the other passengers in the area are a bit like, what's going on with this guy? Not really understanding why he wasn't responding. As the pilot walked over to where this guy was sitting in first class, he just stopped in his tracks. As soon as he laid eyes on this man, he recognised him. Oh my god, it's Bob Loft. And with that, the figure of Bob Loft just vanished. Naturally, everyone was a little bit stunned. You don't just dematerialise in your seat. That's not how air travel works. They searched high and low for this passenger that was there one minute and gone the next. They never found him. No one had an explanation as to how multiple people, staff and passengers, could see this guy and then watch him disappear. But by far, I cannot get this image out of my head. There was a flight attendant who was doing her pre-flight checks and she opened the compartment door on the overhead bin, just checking it all over. But she didn't see hand luggage in there. Oh no, she sees the face of Captain Loft staring back at her. She'd have recognised him anywhere as she'd flown with him before. Dude, why have you got to be so creepy? But Captain Loft, he actually isn't the most commonly witnessed figure, because it seems as though, unlike Loft, who was more of a quiet observer, flight engineer Don Repo, he was keeping himself busy in the afterlife, just trying to help where he could. As a flight engineer was doing his pre-flight checks, going through everything, he said that the full, solid figure of Don Repo appeared right next to him. I'm just gonna leave you to take a second to visualize that. You're at work, doing the do, and the ghost of a man that died on a flight just like yours materializes next to you. Yeah, but Repo, he apparently spoke to this flight engineer and told him, "You don't have to worry about the pre-flight checks, mate. I've already done it." And then he just vanished. Thank you, Mr. Repo, but I'm definitely gonna just double check everything now, just in case. Apparently, he appeared again in the cockpit on another flight and told the pilot, "There will never be another crash of an L-1011. We will not let it happen." Love the enthusiasm, Don. Again, thank you. Although there were other crashes of L-1011s, but there was never another fatal one for Eastern Airlines, so maybe that's what he meant. And there was another story where the pilot and first officer were flying plane 318, and they started hearing this weird banging noise coming from the hellhole. So the pilot, he went and climbed down into the compartment to see what was going on, but there was nothing out of the ordinary down there. As he went to climb back up the ladders though, he looked up and saw Don Repo standing in the cockpit looking down at him, and just as he'd registered who this guy was that was standing in the cockpit that definitely shouldn't have been there, Repo disappeared. What's super interesting about this story is that obviously that is a very weird thing to experience, and so the compartment was thoroughly inspected after that flight, and a potentially fatal malfunction was found, which could have caused a disaster if it had failed while the plane was up in the air. And if that wasn't enough, there was another story from not too long after the first anniversary of the crash, and this time it was the entire cockpit crew who claimed to see this figure of Repo. He'd appeared in the jump seat of the cockpit, just sitting there casual as ever, and he'd shouted out to the crew that they'd got an electrical fault, without even taking the time to comprehend what was actually going on, whether the pilot didn't actually look over and see who had said it or something. The pilot just asked the flight engineer, who was actually living and, on duty, to recheck. Lo and behold, what do you know? There's a fault with the electrical circuit. But when he's not hanging out in the cockpit, it seems like Don Repo really likes being down in the lower galley. Like, a lot. Especially in plane 318. Once, there was an engineer working down there, and again, this was about a year-ish after the crash, so, things are still pretty raw, pretty fresh in everyone's minds. This guy had been working, and he put his screwdriver down next to him, carried on tinkering away, but when he went to grab the screwdriver, it had just gone. He was looking around, getting a bit exasperated, like, where's it rolled off to? And he did that thing where you just, throw your hands up, like, where is it? Bam! He feels the screwdriver get slapped into his hand. No one else around. He is completely on his own down there. He told his co-workers that he was not ashamed to admit that he'd had to run off the plane to calm himself down. I don't know, it just sounds like Don Repo just trying to be as useful as he can be. But after finding out about these next stories, I can honestly see why some flight attendants just straight up refuse to work down in the lower galley alone. There was one flight attendant and she was there preparing for passenger service, when she just so happened to glance up in the general direction of the ovens. Obviously, they have a glass window, and she caught sight of what she thought was her own reflection, only it was not her. And it wasn't a reflection either. As she looked closer, because it definitely looked off to her, she quickly realised that it was a disembodied head inside the oven, and that it had the face of Don Repo. She freaks out, understandably, and went to grab another flight attendant. The second attendant also sees the head inside the oven. Okay, way above my pay grade, so they get the flight engineer down there too. He sees it too. Yep, that's Repo's head in the oven. At this point, the head started to speak and says, "Watch out for fire on this airplane." Disembodied head giving me ominous warnings. I'm out. Good luck, everyone. Call me when you get home safe, but it's time for me to go. The flight did land safely that day, but not too long after, while the plane was on the ground in Mexico City, one of the engines caught fire and had to be shut down. They got it all sorted and under control and got clearance to fly back to Eastern's base for maintenance, just using the two remaining engines. But after barely making it 400 foot off the runway, another fire broke out in one of the two working engines, and they had to make an emergency landing. So I don't appreciate the creepiness of the head in the oven, Repo. Points for originality, I'll give you that, and thanks for the warning and all, but yeah, maybe he was bored that day. In another story, an attendant was down in the lower galley again, this time cleaning the ovens before takeoff from Atlanta. And she was there working away. It was a warm summer night, but she all of a sudden was overcome with this dreadful cold feeling. You know when you feel like you've just got that chill in your bones kind of feel? She stopped what she was doing and looked straight at the glass door of the oven in front of her to see the reflection of a uniformed man standing behind her. So this time it really was a reflection. She spun round thinking, oh, it must have been a colleague who's crept up on her, but nope. As she turned to look, there was no one there. She looked back at the glass door, and there this reflection was, still standing right behind her, watching her. No! She bolted back up into the cabin, absolutely terrified, and told her supervisor what she had just seen. In the most nonchalant way, the supervisor was like, "Oh yeah, him, we see him every now and again, it happens." Excuse me, what? Because it seems like Don Repo really has some sort of connection with these ovens. Another flight attendant went down into the lower galley to see that the flight engineer was fixing an oven, never thought anything of it. Only later on, when she was chatting to the flight engineer on that flight, he told her, no, that wasn't me fixing an oven, and there's no other flight engineer on board. So she was then shown a photo of Don Repo, who she recognised as the man who she had in fact seen fix the oven. But even workers who aren't part of the crew have had encounters with Don. A catering team were once loading food trays into plane 318 when they saw the figure of a flight engineer standing in the galley. All's good, nothing amiss here just yet. And then he disappeared right in front of their eyes. Nope, nah, no thank you, not happening. They refused to go back on board for a long time after that. Can you even blame them though? But there have also been strange, unexplainable banging sounds heard in that lower galley. Whispers and that unmistakable feeling like you're not alone down there. You're being watched very closely. But it's one thing for Don Repo to pop up helping the crew, but when he starts appearing to passengers? Okay, Don. There was one woman who was just sitting in a seat on this flight, minding her own business, when she noticed this very pale, very dazed looking man in a uniform sitting near to her. And so she was concerned, right? She's a good person, and so she called a flight attendant over to check on him. He looked like he needed an orange juice and a lie down, really. As soon as the flight attendant went over to this guy, he vanished. Pulled a Captain Bob Loft on these witnesses. Apparently, once they got this woman passenger calmed down, because obviously now she's in hysterics, they show her a photo of the Flight 401 crew to see if she recognises any of them. Who does she pick out of the lineup? None other than Don Repo. So at least for some passengers flying on an Eastern Airlines L-1011, they would know something was up, especially that 318. There was one instance when 318 was flying from New York to Miami, so exactly the same journey that Flight 401 had attempted to make, and they'd just got to the Everglades, so they were on the approach to Miami International, when a man's voice came over the PA system to announce the standard "put your seatbelt on, no smoking" announcement as they approach for landing. Super routine, you wouldn't bat an eye, right? Thing was, no one on the crew made that announcement. Yep, you heard me right. No one in the cockpit or cabin claimed to have touched that PA system. The crew insisted that it wasn't even in use at that time. So who could have been making the announcement? Bob Loft trying something new other than sitting in first class? Don Repo being his usual helpful self? And just the fact that it happened over the Everglades, the exact area where Flight 401 went down. Let's just say I wouldn't be feeling super great about that landing if I'd have known. And reports like this, especially if people were flying on plane 318, they were just piling up all throughout the 70s into the 80s. Even with the whole talk about this and you're fired thing, people were still coming forward. And eventually, apparently, Eastern Airlines was like, okay, fine, enough is enough. The story goes that they decided to remove all of the transplanted parts that had come from Flight 401. They did it quietly, didn't kick up a fuss, but it was this great expense, even though there was nothing physically wrong with these parts. And then, after the parts were removed, Eastern Airlines crews said that they never witnessed a weird encounter with Captain Loft or Don Repo again, as if they'd just clocked out, they'd done their bit. Eastern Airlines themselves, they weren't about to go admitting to anything. Right up until the company collapsed in 1991, they maintained that the stories weren't real. According to them, it was just an inside joke among the crew. But what is very interesting is that after Eastern Airlines shut down, some of their Lockheed L-1011 TriStar jets were acquired by Delta Airlines. And wouldn't you know it, there were rumours of weird things happening on those planes too. Is that a coincidence? Or just that these planes' reputations precede them? Because for this whole story, skeptics love to point out that there's no factual evidence that support the claim about the parts being salvaged from the crash and used. And so then in turn, no evidence that the parts were taken off again. There's just zero official documentation, nothing concrete to say for sure. But then again, if Eastern Airlines were trying to cover this up, would they keep a paper trail? And they certainly wouldn't make it public, surely. There was a website that I found that claimed to show a salvaged panel from N310EA, so plane 310, Flight 401, the one that went down, that had been installed on another plane, N318EA, so plane 318, the one that allegedly had all of the ghosts. And this photo had been taken after 318 had been scrapped and had shown these serial numbers on stickers and whatnot, as well as a date, the 30th of October 1972. But then there were more skeptics in the comments on that website saying, nah, that can't be right, inspection dates don't line up, because the specific stickers would have been attached to parts when they arrived brand new in the factory and not as they were being swapped as replacements. And so there's a bit of that to consider. Some people say that there's no way any part would have been been salvaged, the devastation was just too bad from the crash. But others argue that the plane landed in the Everglades. It was as cushiony a crash as you're gonna get landing in a swamp. So there's so much back and forth. And I think unless someone high up who was working for Eastern Airlines comes forward and says that they definitely did use parts for the plane, we're never really gonna know for sure. From what I could find, it didn't look like anyone had gone on record like that. So it's all a bit of hearsay. The whole part transplanting thing is a legend and is used as an explanation for these ghost stories. But even if the parts weren't installed onto other planes after the Flight 401 crash, how did so many people have these weird encounters with Captain Bob Loft and flight engineer Don Repo? Some people like to say that, oh, maybe their deaths weigh heavily on Eastern Airlines crew's minds. It was a huge tragedy, and it absolutely was. Others say maybe it's something to do with the altitude. I know it's a pressurized sardine can in the sky, but that might have something to do with it. Maybe. But how can we explain the witnesses recognizing Loft and Repo, who had absolutely no idea who these men were, let alone what they actually look like? And then with the warnings about faults and malfunctions on the plane, which turned out to be true, is a lot to think about. Of course, we've also got to bear in mind that a lot of these stories were shared anonymously in order for Fuller to compile his book. And so for a lot of these stories, while we know a lot happened on 318, there were other planes involved, and we don't know the names, we don't know flight paths, crews, witnesses, any of that, which makes verifying the story very difficult. Although it has got to be said, Peter Underwood did actually vouch for Fuller in his book Peter Underwood's Guide to Ghosts and Haunted Places. He said that actually he was quite impressed with Fuller. Peter admits the shortcomings of the research in the anonymity thing, but overall, Peter was satisfied with Fuller's work. And let's not forget that sharing these stories, if you were found out, you were at risk of losing your job, getting sent to the shrink, and even ridicule amongst your peers. There wasn't really much to gain from making it up. Nowadays, the ghosts of Flight 401 continue to be talked about. They're a much more widely known phenomenon than back when they were being reported in the 70s and 80s. But more crucially, so is the tragedy. CRM training continues to teach pilots based off the lessons learned in this crash. And in 2022, on the 50-year anniversary, a memorial was put up in Miami Springs to honour those that were lost that night. But while I was just getting this story ready for you, I stumbled across something very interesting. So plane number 318, with the tail number N318EA, she wasn't one of the L-1011s sold to Delta Airlines when Eastern collapsed. 318 was actually sold to Cathay Pacific in 1989 and given the new registration VRHOI. She served until the 5th of July 1995, when she was then flown to Germany and broken up the following year, which is when the photo of that part with the serial number was taken, which may or may not have been from plane 310. After 318 was stripped, she apparently was shipped over to South Korea, where she became a cafe, and then an ice cream shop. The place has been refurbished and seemingly changed hands quite a lot. I couldn't find any super up-to-date information. The latest I could find was a Google Street View from 2018, and she was still there, sitting next to the lake in Daegu, painted yellow. Right, so this is going to come off as really cynical, but if she is still there, whoever owns that plane is sitting on a gold mine. Do you know how many people would pay to hire the plane out for the night for paranormal investigations if they knew the history and the ghost story attached to it? See if the spirits of Bob Loft and Don Repo are still there. No, seriously though, that is incredibly cool, and I really do hope that she is still there and open and that people can visit her, because one day, if I'm ever over in that neck of the woods, that would just be amazing to see. But at the end of the day, Flight 401 deserves to be remembered for what it was, a profound tragedy that claimed so many lives. Loft, Repo, and the entire crew that night were deeply dedicated to their work, and if their spirits really did linger, maybe it was because they weren't ready to stop protecting people just yet. Because it is so important to remember the humanity behind this story, how this would have impacted so many people, family members who lost loved ones in the crash, colleagues who lost friends, not to mention the survivors who carried the physical and emotional scars of that night for the rest of their lives. With the shockwaves that this tragedy would have sent out, it's really not hard to see why some might believe that the ghosts of these crew members stayed behind, still watching over the plane and the passengers. And it's for that reason, plus the sheer number of witness testimony from after the crash, I really do think that there is something paranormal going on here. Yes, yes, a lot of the stories were anonymous, but I really don't think that the witnesses had anything to gain from lying and making up the story. If anything, they were risking themselves. So yeah, I do think that Don Repo was doing his best from beyond the grave, and Bob Loft just wasn't ready to hang up his wings just yet. But of course, I want to know what you think. Tell me your thoughts, your opinions. Is there something to it? Or was it more about the trauma and imaginations and things like that? But if you enjoyed this video, please do hit the like button, and do think about subscribing if you haven't already. I bring you a new ghost story every week, so I'd love to see you back here for another one. But anyway, that is all from me today. Go and get yourself a drink of water, good old H2O. Stay hydrated, please. I cannot wait to chat with you more about the morbid, mysterious and macabre. So until next time, sleep safe. I feel like my sleeves have been up and down this whole recording, but I've just been getting too hot and cold. It's winter time and this heating isn't very good in this room, so it might look a little bit weird when I finally put it all together.